Thanks, Nick. So hello and welcome to Lunar Denizens. Welcome back for those of you who are actually with us in the previous events as well. For those who are not, my name is Sitraka Rakotoniaina. I'm, as Nick said, one of the moderator on this conversation along with Andrew Friend. We are, hello. We are London-based artists and designers, and we are running this event as part of our research project called Very, Very Far Away, or VVFA for short, which focuses on space narratives and world building. So thanks again for joining us. Now, for those of you who may not be aware, Lunar Denizens is a three-part series of conversations centering around imagining the protocols, folklore, artifacts, rituals, and things shaping the mythos of our fictional lunar settlement, Mare Nectaris. And this is part 2 of the series, a series that was prompted by a conversation that took place back in June, where our kind of guests laid down the groundwork for ideas, themes, and subjects shaping the current event, exploring the Biennale's theme, how will we live together, and using this space settlement as a conceptual device, but also as an opportunity to examine the meaning of human presence in space, and more particularly on the moon in this particular case. Now, I would like to take 2 minutes to give a quick summary of the ideas that we mentioned and looked into previously relating to the Moonlife, and also ideas that I would like to use as a starting point for this conversation. So previously on Mare Nectaris, we've mentioned and briefly explored the idea of that beyond the practical tasks relating to work and survival, managing what actually DeWitt Kilgore referred as the software, the human software, was equally important. Managing psychological factors and providing spaces for letting your head down, avoiding cabin fever, releasing interpersonal tensions related to stress, isolation, etc., etc. So perhaps it might be interesting to define and discuss what these spaces could be, what could necessary recreational activities be, even though recreation may be more associated with space tourism and aimed at attracting people and money. Some of these activities need to somehow be designed and thought about as well within the context of this tight-knit community permanently inhabiting the moon. We've also discussed the way we may want to structure our time, the structure of work, life, and again, recreation within a 28 days day-night cycle. What opportunities are there from an organizational perspective? What shape does the week take in comparison to the classic one, 5 days of work, 2 days of rest? Fred Sharman actually proposed slices of 6 hours to organize our time around, which we may be discussing later if the conversation goes there. And by extension, we also touched on the notion of a certain nocturnality, with 14 days of nighttime being ideal for continuous clubbing and gambling sessions on one hand, but also very useful for stargazing and eventually kind of earth gazing as well, perhaps. Basically, an interesting angle could be looking into ways of coping with this alien environment, whilst at the same time gauging the opportunities that it could provide. Another set of ideas we've mentioned as well are the legal obligations surrounding health and safety, from the settlements, built environment, and architectural planning to protocols to ensure mutual aid despite potential differences and even resources regulations, manufacturing, etc. We also wondered whether the harshness of the lunar environment would force mutuality, or on the contrary, favor ruthless competition, or as Tamara Alvarez put it, would this actually lead to some frontier type of thinking? And this led us as well to discuss data protection in relation to private companies, which is perhaps not necessarily in line with the Mare Nectaris' global union, but rather in line with current businesses' postures, where secrecy, as well as the idea of manufacturing safety zones to protect businesses' data from spies and thieves, may lead to corporate territories and land grabbing contentions. Then finally, one last thing I thought it could be worth thinking of is perhaps as well our relationship to nature, from artificial curation in the style of the silent running with its kind of botanical space domes, to perhaps the development of a certain cultural sensibility towards this magnificent lunar desolation. Now, in terms of general expectation for this conversation, this event today is an opportunity to imagine and describe the built environment that capture the culture and the social dynamics of this community. So in other words, how can the built environment actually help manufacturing a sense of community? How can this manufactured local culture give rise to certain social, economic, and legal realities? So yeah, I would like to invite everyone and our guests to imagine and discuss together the objects, the structures, protocols, systems, and continue building these sorts of catalog of lunar things that are yet to be imagined. And yeah, sorry.
So that's the basic plan for today's session. Also, as well as our guests, we really want to open the conversation up to everybody in the chat and everybody who's present here, kind of witnessing the conversation as well, to get involved. And we've created a series of kind of party cards, we call them, in a Google slide. So I'll just put the link in here in the chat. Hopefully that'll work. And if I share my screen, I can just show what that means, or what we've created for that, which is basically a shared Google document, slide document, where there's just some kind of outlines that we can fill in with a name of an idea or an object or an element of this kind of moon settlement, or a thing that you think might be interesting to share with us. And you can just start to fill in the kind of different things about it. So what this thing might be, who it's for, general description, what have you. It's more just a framework for kind of sharing ideas. So we really invite people everybody really to get involved with that in parallel with the conversations that are taking place.
Yeah, and now we're gonna just move into the introduction. So I would like, so we have with us today Alice Bucknell. So hello, Alice, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Alice Bucknell. I'm an artist and a writer from the United States, and I'm currently based in London. I have a background in architecture and anthropology. In my practice, I work a lot with speculative fiction, and primarily within video game engines like Unreal Engine, to explore relationships and entanglements between the environment, technology, magic, non-human, and machine intelligence. Recently, I've been experimenting a lot with the language AI, GPT-3, and I'm currently working on a new video project about Mars, ecological mysticism, and language. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Sounds great. Thank you very much. And then we're going to move on to Professor Nicholas De Monchaux.
Oh, thanks so much. My name is Nicholas De Monchaux. I'm a professor of architecture and urban studies and planning here at MIT, where I'm also currently head of the architecture department. I started June 1st, 2020. There was nothing going on at the time, so it's been very relaxing. I'm a great believer in the assertion of the great Rainer Banham that we learn the most about architecture in its absence. So my own thinking has been shaped by everything from writing an architectural history of the Apollo spacesuit, which came out in 2012 from MIT Press, to more recently, before I left my previous institutional home at Berkeley, teaching a year-long studio on science fiction and California's future, which was a collaboration with Jeff Mina of Building Blog fame, amongst other things, and really interested both in what we how we can really learn about a lot of ourselves from the reality of space, and also how we use the spatial imaginary of a place that we don't occupy to learn much more about the places we do occupy. So thanks so much for inviting me to be here today.
Excellent. We're also joined by Nina Lanza. Hi, Nina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nina. I'm a planetary scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory. So I'm in New Mexico with the SFI folks. I work on Mars research projects, including instruments on the Curiosity and Perseverance rovers. But my main experience that I want to share with you today is my work in Antarctica as part of the Antarctic Search for Meteorites project, where I lived in a tent for 6 weeks on the ice recovering meteorites. And so this project is used by NASA as an analog for long duration spaceflight missions.
That's great. Thank you very much. And finally, we also have Ibiye Camp with us. Hi, Ibiye.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. I am an artist and I'm based in London. I have kind of a background in fine arts, which was kind of more kind of installations and kind of very multidisciplinary work. And I also kind of worked in fashion as well, and then kind of entered into the art. I mean, not art. I was already in the art, into architecture later on when I kind of started to explore more about occupying space and digital infrastructures. And I now work in video and using augmented reality and also gaming engines. And so I'm kind of working between multiple disciplinaries, and I'm very curious of space. I've never worked with the subject of space before, so I'm very intrigued. But at the moment, I'm running a studio at the Royal College of Arts with Dele Adeyemo and Amasa Randolph, where we have a studio which is about worlding within the ruins of racial capitalism, where we kind of challenging architectural tools and Western epistemologies when it comes to architecture and cartography and things like that. So I'm very intrigued by the conversation today. I'm not an expert, very kind of the conversations that we're having. So thank you so much for having me. Very excited.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. Okay, maybe we should get started, Sitraka.
Yes, indeed. So the way the format is like divided in two moments. One is called the New Dawn, and I'm just going to read you a piece of like a small paragraph for starting this conversation. So, routine and repetition form the backbone of life in Mare Nectaris. Daily rituals provide structure and reference within the facility. From personal hygiene, employment, and caregiving to station maintenance, the daily cycles and processes are not only necessary for individual well-being, but also the collective health and safety of all settlers. In such an environment, how does one release the tensions associated with extraterrestrial life? How does the built environment take care of their human software? And what other roles are required beyond the ones solving our practical needs for productivity and survival? And this is the opening questions, open to anyone on this call. Do we need space troubadours?
Well, maybe I'll just start and say, you know, I think routine is a really important part of any extreme environment. You know, in order to maintain, sanity, I think we in Antarctica have very strict schedules. That being said, I think it's also really important. You need to have times when you're working together, recreating together, but also have time by yourself, because that's something that we don't always think about when we live here on Earth. We have lots of times where we move between these sort of three spheres. We're working together, we're playing together, and then we have time alone. And so we have to make sure, I think, to plan those three types of activities into every day when we're on the moon.
I think that's a really important point. And I think one of the things we wanted to kind of dig into and maybe to help kind of encourage some kind of thought about this is really what do we do in that downtime when we're on the moon? Because we're in a kind of work-based facility, essentially, on Mare Nectaris. And we want to start to kind of open up the conversation to imagine what kind of things we might do with this time. One of the things we talked about or touched upon previously was thinking a bit about music and maybe our relationship to that. I see, Ibiye, you've got a wall full of instruments behind you. I don't know if this is something maybe we could think about in terms of maybe how we use this kind of time when we're not working, and maybe this time when we're alone as well on space, because when we're constantly working in teams with people, maybe it is, as you say, Nina, getting away from everybody is perhaps quite difficult in this environment. I don't know. That's again something maybe which we can start to expand upon.
Yeah, I would say also I was curious just in the small conversation that we had yesterday and thinking about general like activities that we could do on the moon. I was wondering like even how sound travels when you're on the moon. Are the frequencies different? Because I really don't know. And so I think obviously there's downtime and routines and things like that, and moments where you would want to like have personal interactions with people. Maybe that's a quieter time where you would want to whisper and or kind of have more of a one-on-one conversation, or even sing, but not sing to a crowd. And so how would the downtime or the moment of communication in a more intimate kind of moment away from the rest of the group happen? Quite interesting question.
Yeah, that reminds me of something I was reading a little earlier this week about the Mars simulation in Hawaii, 6 or 7 years ago. I think it was 8 or 9 scientists were asked to basically live inside of this dome for 8 months, and one of them was a musician, and she was just like, I couldn't practice, or I couldn't even if I was in my room, because nothing was soundproofed. So I think it's even just comes down to the bare bones of the architecture of being able to, I guess, both create communal spaces where people can, play an instrument together or engage in some kind of event together, but then also ensuring that there is the kind of sonic and spatial definitions of individual rooms and places to go where you can practice without feeling like everyone is listening to you.
I think Alice's question is really important one. I think that so I see Sans Fish, my colleague here at MIT, in the virtual room. One of the things he works with the Space Exploration Initiative at the Media Lab, and we've been having conversations about doing urban design studios here at MIT, looking at cities, not on Earth, as a way to think, of course, about cities on Earth, because everything we do in space is all about Earth. There's nothing in space but us. But one of the ways, just to give a dumb example about how thinking about space immediately connects to Earth. One of the big discourses on our time is about ideas like the quote unquote smart city, or the role of technology in urban life, the way in which our life is mediated by a whole bunch of technologies that are designed to optimize our attention, and those technologies are increasingly mediating our experience of urban space too. A space station or a space capsule is already on the other side of that exchange. The day and night schedule is incredibly optimized. People's attention is optimized. It makes sense. That's the whole purpose of the exercise, and the billions of dollars that are being put into it are being put into it for a purpose. But there is a role in our lives for serendipity and chance and boredom and speculation. And one of the really interesting things that I wrote about in or I uncovered in research for my Apollo book, the Apollo program, there's a bunch of white dudes in a something the size of a VW camper van being sent. They're all scientifically and militarily trained. It made total sense for them to be have every second of their lives planned and optimized in this tight 2-week mission to the moon and back, even the longest missions. But then when the same protocols were used to run the later part of the Apollo application programs during Skylab, the third and longest staying Skylab crew actually went on strike about 10 days into the mission, turned off the radios, refused all contact with Earth. It's kind of been absorbed into the history, into kind of the official history, and is not really spoken about. But there was an amazing New Yorker article in the 1970s that sort of uncovered the whole story. And basically they said, no, we need boredom, we need music, we need to look out the window, we need all these components of life that had been left out of this optimized, kind of, I would like to think of it as a kind of smart city version of life and so, how do we, talking about designing and engineering an off-world habitat, we find ourselves in this utopian sense having a conversation about, well, how do you optimize boredom? How do you optimize serendipity? How do you, which interestingly enough, which in fact may be impossible questions to answer, but I find them very interesting.
It's quite fantastic to think that you want to have space for boredom on the moon. Yeah. It just sounds like something that is just completely kind of contradictory, but I think to have that space of boredom maybe allows the
Ibiye, you cutting out actually.
As well about kind of just time. Oh, I have bad internet. I'm sorry.
Right, maybe do you want to repeat your last question or your last point?
I don't know. I was just commenting that it's just amazing to have the urge to want to have boredom while you're on the moon, and I think it's really important, like you said, for moments of stargazing to actually realize where you are, and not to have a kind of full kind of run schedule the whole time. It's actually about the experience of being away from Earth. It was more of a comment. Yeah.
That sounds good. Actually, this reminds me a conversation that we had with Andrew, was preparing today's session, and we were talking about potentially, like, in these particular questions, actually, what would be the role of technology within entertainment, not necessarily music technology or things like that, but we were thinking, for instance, like artificial intelligence and relationship of like using artificial intelligence in relation to leisure. And we were kind of like laughing at the idea that maybe we would create this kind of like artificial intelligence would become this sort of like storyteller, the creator of folk music, the gatherer of information in terms of the history of the place. And then we started wondering, actually, from this particular thing, wondering actually with this particular, I mean, in this particular context of the community, it's like, how do we actually write history? Since like, if you were to actually dedicate some aspects of that to new technology, I don't know if anyone's got a particular comment on that, or if it inspires any particular question, perhaps. Or not, doesn't really matter.
Wait, I'm sorry, I don't want to derail this. I was trying to unmute myself and I couldn't do it, but I'd like to go back to the idea of boredom, because actually I love this, because that's where I think when I kind of give myself this chance to space out, you know, I come up with my best ideas. But that being said, I think it's really important to acknowledge that when you live in an extreme environment, as the lunar environment will undoubtedly be for many, many years, you know, even in its best, it'll still be challenging. That one of the reasons that we tend to want to have a really prescribed day is to help prevent some of the, I want to say, despair that can really happen because you are isolated, because it can be incredibly challenging. I'll bring as an example Shackleton's very famous, in many ways ill-fated, but in many ways incredible expedition, where, you know, his ship was lost and he still managed to get everyone back alive. Back to Europe, which was amazing. And one of the things that he did was actually have every day there was a schedule. And you know what, they're on like ice. What are they going to do? But he made sure that every day everyone gets up and just starts to do something. Everyone has a job, because in fact, you have to be careful in these extreme environments. It can be very challenging sometimes when you are sitting alone or even with a group trying to grapple with the challenge of your experience. It can actually be corrosive, which is something that I experienced just being in Antarctica, even with all of the technology that we have, that kind of isolation, the otherworldliness of the environment, how different it is from what we're used to, and the fact that we're with only a few people and not our full communities. So we have to be careful. I think we have to balance that, making space for this productive time that's personal, while also not allowing things to kind of go off the rails as they might. I know it sounds a little bit crazy, but I felt like, you know, without that structure, I had a lot of time to brood. And I'm not really a brooding person. I feel like I'm generally pretty cheerful, but it's very challenging out there. And sometimes without that focus of something next to do, I could see that turning badly for the group.
A little bit like Nicholas was alluding to, with a kind of compressed boredom. So it's scheduled in, you have your boredom and you need to really focus it down, digest it, do it, and then back to task. So it's kind of take the boredom pill and then get on with your day almost. I wonder how that can kind of start to be fitted into our routines, I suppose. The Shackleton reference as well is a really interesting example in terms of people being stranded out in a situation and having to kind of use that routine as a way of managing the group, so as you say, not to lead into some kind of destructive, kind of falling to pieces at the seams.
there be space for procrastination as well, do you say? Like, I don't know, when just thinking about kind of on downtime, people obviously, you know, will reply to emails or call family or something. Would there be like any type of moments where, you know, you could, you know, like post a story to Instagram or something called this kind of procrastination time? With that
pseudo productivity that kind of exists, right? It's like I'm working, I'm doing this kind of posting stuff here, doing this stuff, but actually how much is actually being achieved? But yeah, so again, kind of managing people and keeping everybody happy.
Yeah.
It's getting a few kind of links on the chat here coming up with this with people. One of the interesting one here being the kind of right to tune in or tune out, perhaps, of this kind of life and what's going on there, how that's controlled, when it can happen, perhaps, how you actually make these routines fit to the people in there, or if it's all based around the actual maintenance and operation of the base rather than the individuals who are running it. Poker games, encouraging chance into a regulated life.
Yeah, I was about to read that one as well. Caitlin comments on this is quite interesting. It's just like the first generation of Lunar Denizens experience would be the most austere. Potentially. They're the ones who are like probably figuring out things as they go. But with regard to these kind of activities, we were kind of also wondering what would be, with regard to specificities related to the moon, what would be the sort of activities that are very specific or opportunities that are enabled to the way, I mean, I don't know, gravity. Last time we were mentioning, for instance, like the idea of loping or skipping as a kind of strategy to move around the settlement because of the difference in gravity and etc. But what we were really wondering, and a little bit like the thing that I mentioned eventually in the introduction, such as this kind of like nocturnal 15 or 14 days rather, is there any kind of opportunities there that can be used to kind of like create these not necessarily recreating things or recreating some similar type of boredom with activities that are back on Earth, but is there anything that can be very moon specific in that way?
I guess I'd make 2 points there related to the previous point. I think, you know, as someone who has spent most of my life thinking about cities and not necessarily about outer space, I think modularity is important in space and time. And this is also my like hat tip to the Santa Fe Institute and and evolutionary thinking in general. But we are able to create the most variation and invention within a certain structure. And so if within the New York City grid, you're able to have, you know, Rockefeller Center and Soho, you know, they're very different ideas about urban space, but they exist within the same underlying structure. And that structure, you know, the clock and the calendar also gives us the same structure in time. Something like a liturgical calendar is in fact a cathedral in time that gives you different parts of the year to do different kinds of things in different spaces, a day of atonement, a day of celebration, etc. So I think time has the same kind of modularity and structure, and you can do more within a structure than you can outside of it. That's sort of, I guess, the sort of the Shackleton idea. And then the second, no, I guess I'll leave it there.
I was thinking a little bit just now about like the significance of the landscape of the moon, and yeah, I mean, kind of thinking about geologic like gathering points. I mean, perhaps this could be a way of arranging a temporal cycle where certain sites are, you know, become hosts for rituals at certain time of the year. Perhaps not modeling or following the Earth's own seasons, but maybe in some other like dilated time frame. But I do think the significance of having a designated space that means something, even if it doesn't look anything like geographically prominent sites on Earth, is really significant for building a community and kind of existing inside of that shared physical space and also a shared space of ritual.
Absolutely. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was thinking that, so as a geologist, I was like, I'm listening closely to you here. So thinking about the current location, I think that also brings up, what are the protocols surrounding leaving the base? Because it'll be essentially a dome or something subterranean. And so in this mare that we're in, there are actually numerous craters. It's a very flat volcanic plain. But within there is some topography that would be presumably accessible by something like a dune buggy. I don't think that it's close enough where it's really feasible, even in low gravity, to walk there. So there would be, I think that brings up the question, how do we want to facilitate leaving, right? I would say yes. I mean, I would want to be able to have the opportunity. That also, though, brings up, some safety protocol issues. How do you do that? And then what kind of vehicles are you allowed to use? Presumably there's some bigger equipment that more, trained people would be able to use, something smaller that you could check out like a bike. I don't know. I think that's a really interesting idea. So how do we, like we do on Earth, we try to bring outside in a little bit. Do we want to do that? Or do we want to kind of block it out and only go there when we want to do these, have these events or rituals, as you said? I don't know, actually, if I know what would be better, right? We could either like leave it to make it special or try to incorporate it into everyday life. I'm interested to hear what you guys think.
I really like the idea of kind of like you have in London these city bikes that you can, in quite a lot of cities, that you can take on the moon, and then off you go to kind of cycle up the kind of up the peak at the middle of the crater. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, a dune buggy kind of like stop off point, and there, maybe or BMX, as Jose is saying. That would be amazing, actually. Some mountain bikes that could take you to a particular spot. And I don't know if they would be the same, if they would have kind of like little kind of like input and outputs with where you can top it up with your contactless card or whatever, like similar to how it is in London. But it's super interesting thinking of a point to gather. And is it predominantly like flat then on the moon? Like would there be a point, kind of an arrangement of rocks or something? You know how oh gosh, the movie Space Odyssey, where the way that it begins with the kind of the rock at the beginning, is there's like always a particular kind of arrangement of that somehow seems out of this world. And how would that be defined on the moon? This kind of maybe particular kind of point of a rock arrangement, maybe, that people would come to kind of view in a way, and maybe start to kind of see it as a prominent or special kind of good luck kind of space to go and reflect or something.
We know
sorry, it just reminds me a bit of the kind of tours you have in the southwest of England, and these kind of, like Glastonbury, for instance, is this kind of point of mythical or mythic kind of significance. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And these kind of points within the landscape that maybe have a little bit of something built on the top of them, just to kind of really highlight their significance. That idea of how we craft and create nodes within the landscape, I suppose, or points of interest, places within this bigger space, is something that's maybe interesting to elaborate on in a bit. But Nicholas, sorry.
Oh, no, well, actually, I would change the point I make, but I think we don't know what it really will be like ultimately to occupy that landscape, because there's a few things we do know. One, the spatiality is inherently different. The moon does have a topography that the astronauts said that reminded them of the Southwest desert of the United States, sort of rocks, desolation, rolling landscape. You can't quite see all the things, but one of the things I actually have an ongoing conversation with Hashim Sarkis, the curator of the Biennale, about is what the horizon does on the moon, and he's convinced it might curve because it's so much closer to you. I'm convinced that it won't, because it basically, the analogy is that on the moon you have the same relationship to the horizon that you do on Earth, except for you're always in a 30-story building. So if you imagine, the moon is 1/6 the size of the Earth. but you are, if you're in a 30-story building, you're 6 times as tall as you would be normally. But it is still a different, so I don't think it would be curved, but I think you would have a very different spatial relationship to space and the horizon. And the Apollo astronauts did talk about feeling like you got to things closer, got to things sooner, as slow as you were moving, because your relationship to the whole horizon and landscape was fundamentally different. But then the way that they moved in the landscape was also not only different from Earth, but very different from how people expected them to move. In my tiny knowledge of Apollo spacesuit history, one example that I have is it turns out when they were, and this is, I'm sure, Nina, when you were collecting your meteorites on Antarctica, you were bending down in a somewhat normative human way, even as you were constricted by no doubt lots of insulated clothing. But it turns out that the Apollo astronauts figured out the best way to collect rocks was to do the splits, was to jump up. Because of the way that the pressure suit went and the gravity did, if they jumped up, did the splits, they landed, grabbed the rock, and then went back up again. And it's not something the spacesuit was designed to do. And when they saw this in mission control, they flipped out and went and did tests with the spacesuits on the Earth to see if they could withstand this as a. And so, we have no. And it was just a natural human adaptation to the circumstances. But I would consider that a tiny little keyhole window on types of movements, types of relationships to space that we just really can't speculate about, let alone what you would do in a pressurized space where you weren't constricted by a spacesuit in terms of how you might discover an ability to move.
Yeah, this is something actually that we sort of like discussed a little bit as well last time. I think it's like Haim Ben Araya actually was pointing out the fact that you're on the moon, but your body is never necessarily in direct contact with the moon because you're enclosed within an habitat, you're enclosed within a spacesuit, you're enclosed. Your kind of like experience of the world is always mediated through this kind of health and safety, that kind of like protective gear that you have around you, and etc. So it's very kind of interesting to. Although I guess it's very difficult, but I still it's quite interesting to try to think about these potential relationship that your body has with the space in general. I really find amazing this idea of doing the split to pick up the rocks, and I'm just wondering if you can actually then engineer. Like, then would there be like a lot of engineering going into designing spacesuit for different type of postures that are basically figured out as some adaptations are being made once Lunar Denizens kind of been around for quite some time, and etc. Perhaps, and then this. So as an extension of that, actually, one question that we were thinking of as well about this idea of the fact that we're wearing these kind of we kind of like mediating, we never kind of directly in touch with the surrounding area. And also it's a little bit in contradiction with what we were discussing, this idea of going outdoorsy and looking around and etc. Actually, wouldn't it be a situation where you kind of actually fear the outside as well on the opposite end? Because going outside is actually extremely dangerous every single time. Being there is extremely dangerous, I suppose. But going and I don't know, having activity on the surface might be even more so in that respect. So how does that relationship to the outside becomes like, could it be that we constantly fear the outside in some ways?
I was actually talking yesterday with, I don't do this all the time, but it so happened that yesterday was, there's a great class here at MIT taught now by David Mendel, which is a kind of cultural and technology history of Apollo generally. We had a spacesuit session, and the co-teacher of that class, Jeff Hoffman, was a shuttle astronaut in the 1980s, and he said that in his conversations with particularly with the geologists and people who are on the later Apollo missions, everything ended up being this conversation about dust and the toxicity and incredible qualities of lunar dust, which as I think you folks may know, doesn't come from erosion. It comes from thousands of millions of micrometeoroid impacts over millions of years. And so when a micrometeoroid impacts the dust, there's a little explosion and there's sort of shrapnel, rock shrapnel from the explosion on the surface of the moon. And this is what the dust is. I'm bringing coals to Newcastle, explaining this to Nina, but what the qualities of that dust are amazing because they, it's not only, it gets into everything, it sticks to everything like Velcro. And because more often than not, it has like 2 points on it, it walks like a little, like across surfaces. As it's vibrated, it actually moves. And so basically what this means is if the Apollo 17 astronauts had to do a fourth EVA, they did 3 on their missions, they actually didn't think they'd be able to get a seal on their spacesuits because this dust was coating everything and getting into everything and preventing them from being able to, and so they were really nervous if anything had happened on that mission. And so, you know, this is a huge design parameter for actually living life on the surface of the moon, is this incredible, you know, messiness of the lunar surface. We think of it being empty, but it's full of stuff.
We're going to need some really good lunar vacuum cleaners on the base then to clean all of these suits off. Job for a vacuum cleaner manufacturer out there, to put any names out. This is I don't know if perhaps maybe out in Antarctica, the relationship between this kind of landscape that you're in, one of kind of awe and wonder, maybe awe is perhaps the right kind of way to look at it. And it's about a respect of the landscape that you're in and that we need to have in this situation. I don't know whether it's fear or respect, how that plays out down at the bottom of the world.
Yes, it's actually really, I felt like it was a really complex emotional experience that I didn't expect to have. So of course it is an incredibly beautiful landscape, but what you come to realize when you're living there is that Antarctica is huge and does not care about you, and you don't matter at all. And there are some incredibly dangerous situations that can arise really quickly. And it's not malicious, it's just that you don't matter at all. And I've never felt so small as I did when I was there. And so in many ways, we don't want to fear the outside, but we have to respect it. We have to respect that there's nothing that is going to save us but ourselves. And we have to plan well and be careful because storms can come up really quickly and no one can save us, right? Literally no one will fly out there to help us. We have to help ourselves. And so, it's very stressful in a lot of ways. I did try sometimes to take a moment to like zoom out of the work that I was doing and just appreciate how beautiful and stark and alien the landscape was and how privileged I was to be one of the few human beings who will ever see this. There are so few people who really have the chance to be in the interior of that continent. And that's probably going to be true on the moon, even as we settle. It will still be a small subset of people. And so I think to me, that was the way that I was trying to cope with the unbearable desolation and danger that, we were in at every moment. One of my teammates was walking along, stepped through a tiny snow bridge into a crevasse and like almost broke her ankle. And she didn't, thank goodness, right? But she was pretty injured, right? And it was just like nothing, no one would have come out. No one would have helped us. I mean, the ice that would have broken her ankle was absolutely beautiful. It was pure blue, and yet, it didn't even care. It didn't even notice that we were there. So yeah, I think it'll take a concerted effort to be able to love the landscape while still respecting it.
Sounds like, taking a walk becomes like extreme sport. So that's very far from doing BMX and backflips on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what Nina was just saying about the lunar settlers or denizens' reliance upon the Earth and resources there, and even just like communication, that was something I was thinking about a little earlier today. I mean, just the psychology of feeling that much closer to the Earth than you would if you were on Mars or some other planet. The fact that you could see it, the fact that messages could be passed back and forward much, much quicker. I was kind of thinking about the paradoxical element of that, and maybe it would almost be harder for lunar denizens to become more independent or break their ties, if that's even what they wanted or needed from earthly reliance, if it would be harder for them than it would be for Martian denizens or settlers, just because of the psychology of having the earth and your previous life. Or, I mean, if you were like a second or third generation lunar citizen, so maybe you never, remembered the earth, but it was still there. Like you could still see it every night, or your night. And just kind of wondering about that proximity and if that would be harder or easier to kind of acclimate.
Well, so there's something interesting there in what Al says. So one of the greatest artifacts of Apollo is the whole Earth photograph that happened in Apollo 17, but that actually had to be very deliberately arranged at the very end of the Apollo missions, because the Apollo missions were all launched when the moon was half full, to maximize the low angle of the sun on the landing site, so you didn't crash into something. And of course, when the moon is half full from the Earth is half full from the moon. So every photograph you see taken from the lunar surface during the Apollo missions has the Earth half full and not the whole disk seen. And so in fact, in the lunar night, you would see, with no light on the direct sunlight on the face of the Earth during the Earth's day, you wouldn't see the Earth at all. And so there's this kind of interesting symbiotic relationship between Earth and Moon that we don't think about as we think about going between them.
I do think that the communication distance will make it feel, like the time delay. It's not as big on the moon as it would be on Mars, but that delay is still disconnects you from the planet. Being in Antarctica, you're like, oh, well, there's no delay, you're on Earth, right? But we still had to communicate through satellites. And it was very hard actually for me we were living on Christchurch time, New Zealand time. And that's just out of convenience because McMurdo Station is where we were primarily based. So yeah, I think I felt so disconnected because I couldn't there was no internet, obviously. I could not just communicate instantaneously. And so I think even with the view of Earth right there or not, I'm not sure that would make as big a difference as the lack of the rapid communication. So maybe, if we had people settling the moon 300 years ago or something, that would be normal for them, right? You're like, you don't talk to people. It's just the way life is. But now that we're used to this really constant communication, it would be more challenging for us now, even given, the technologies that we have.
Talking about communication, actually, it's a little bit like departing from that particular specific idea of communication, but it's sort of related, and this is something that we discussed previously as well, again, very briefly, with this idea of obviously, in the idea, you've got this moon base that is a multicultural place with people from a very international, and we were kind of wondering how does this information actually, this communication or this kind of what kind of information would you get from Earth onto the moon, and what kind of, I don't know, if you had access to different cultural kind of TV program and this kind of thing, or would it be an information that needs just to be curated in some ways, this kind of global Earth news information from Earth going to the moon in general, or we would still have this kind of different type of different shows from different countries all around, etc., etc.
This could be seen as a means of compressing that boredom as well, couldn't it? Curating the content that you're allowed in the base is a means to kind of really focus in that boredom, get it out, and then get back to work.
McMurdo has 4 television stations, and one of them just played Home Alone on an endless loop.
It's always Christmas in Antarctica,
for a long
right?
time.
Was that neglect or deliberate irony?
Hard to say. I don't know who was in charge of that. I'm like, dang, it's that movie again. we weren't in McMurdo for most of the time, but the time that we were was like 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after, and like because it was right around, it was December and January, which is summer, but it was like Christmas. So I think somebody was like, "Oh, it's a Christmas movie.
Right.
Watch this."
That's like the cruelest thing I can imagine.
Home Alone watching Groundhog Day.
Yeah, wrong pole though for the Santa Claus. Is supposed to be in the in the North Pole.
I wonder what would be like the best type of like Earth series or film to have on loop or to have on in the space station if it was the case that there were kind of only a certain amount of screens. Like maybe I think something that like obviously like having the Earth in sight is kind of like a reminder of like why you're there. So maybe having something that's very Earth-like, I don't know, like maybe something like EastEnders or something on, or could be quite kind of a reminder of how far away you are from home, or maybe something that was kind of speculating on Moonlife, maybe like an old school series or something space, like a bit like do you remember the series The Jetsons? I think it was something like that, which was kind of, well, for me was like a childhood kind of beginning, like imaginary of what space would have been like. So a contrast of one television screen that has a soap opera or a sitcom, reality TV or something, and then something that was kind of what we thought we were going to interact with, and the way that we thought that there would be I think the Jetsons, they had like a dog, and then I don't know, maybe like a spacesuit for their dog as well or something. All of these things that kind of would contradict the reality of the harshness of the environment to the very slick. I think there was also like in the opening scenes, there was like an escalator that the Jetsons came in on, like one by one, in a very smooth, slick way, in contrast to the BMX bike or the dune buggy splits. That would kind of, yeah.
I love the idea of the only television being available is soap operas and telenovelas, just kind of exaggerated versions of life on Earth.
I mean, it would have to
be like to murder, you guys.
I mean, I think what someone said in the comments about Attenborough, like I think maybe some National Geographic, but not too much, because people are gonna get depressed if they see that all the time. But then I think like a balance of like kind of I guess nothing from like one particular or like a singular time frame or decade, right? So there's no capacity to get uber nostalgic for like a really specific moment. But then I think having like a combo of like sci-fi and like a kind of future fiction type content as well as historical stuff would be good, just so there's like, a variety, I guess, but also so people don't get too attached to either the idea of the past or the future.
Yeah, there's a new series. Oh, sorry. I was going to say there's just an ambient new kind of category of series, which is just one that isn't too shocking, isn't too offensive. It's more just like a kind of monotone background noise type of series, because you would have had just the most intense experiences like out on kind of on your excursion, and then when you come back, an ambient series is more kind of ideal for your downtime than something that was quite dramatic or
and sums it up nicely in the chat with the fireplace channel. Or the fish tank
Nina's
channel.
maybe super interested now in figuring out what the media history of television on Antarctica is. I think that that's a dissertation right there, but I think that but I now have this new theory that one could really tell an alien race everything they need to know about humanity by the difference between, say, the media we put on the Voyager record, which is how we'd like to be seen by the universe, and the media we actually take to space to watch ourselves. To consume, which that would pretty much tell you the whole story.
these kind of ideas about kind of tying in with home, what we see and how we kind of relate to the world outside, tie in a little bit with a comment that Andreas made in the chat as well, talking about the habitat maybe being underground, and just to try and kind of bring this back a little bit to the actual, maybe the architecture that we're talking about with this space. And again, one of the things we touched on last time in the previous session was thinking a little bit about the design and construction of this habitat. Is it just a kind of membrane between us and the landscape, or is it fortified? Is it perceived as open to the kind of wider world? So if it is an underground base or an underground settlement, which in arguable kind of reality it might well be, at least to start with, or in its early stages, are we actually able to see out of this space? And how much of what we think is outside, if we're only shown a kind of a representation of the outside world, or we only see the outside of this kind of moonscape through screens or through kind of CCTV or what have you, how much of that is actually a fabrication or a kind of real? So you have this kind of imagined moonscape versus a reality, and questions of authorship and control and how this is mediated and moderated come into play. And I wonder if that's something maybe we could expand upon a little bit, or open that up to people to think about.
I mean, I think a window on the moon is going to be a mediated window. I mean, even the Apollo astronauts who are only outside of the Van Allen belts, which ironically the first satellites were designed to investigate, but they protect us from interstellar radiation. There's only really been one sort of transverse health study done of Apollo astronauts, and it was only of cardiovascular health, but they were between 4 and 10 times more likely to suffer from heart disease than ordinary humans, which, when you consider that they were fairly healthy individuals, sort of pre-selected, gives you a sense of what we don't even understand and haven't grappled with, which are the health effects of being out off the Earth's surface for long periods of time. So I would guess, I think someone in the chat posted as well, that we're talking about some serious mass between anyone who's living on the moon for a long period of time and solar radiation, and therefore a window is inherently going to be a media. The word media comes from the Latin for lens, which is just something that comes in between you and something else, but it is going to be a mediated lens, probably in the very contemporary sense. And so, yeah, what that is and what it shows you, I think will be really interesting to think about.
This kind of framing of the gaze through the architecture, or the kind of architectonics of the base is kind of a key thing, what we're looking out onto and how that really is controlled here.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone loves a good panorama, right? But then there's also going to be moments where people are just like, I don't want to fucking see that landscape right now. So I think having spaces that are both kind of boxed in. I mean, I don't know why, when Nicholas was talking, I somehow suddenly started to think about saunas. And I don't know, I guess this capacity of feeling really intense feelings, feelings of heat, feelings of cold. I mean, yeah, this strays slightly from the question of when and in what context to see the landscape and how we relate to it through the architecture. But I guess maybe there's also a relationship there between the sensory experience or the sensory deprivation of being on the moon. And I guess, yeah, kind of plugins or add-ins to that relationship that can kind of help create moments of sensory experience that aren't necessarily deliverable through the landscape, but maybe they have to happen inside. And I guess maybe if the landscape should not be a part of those experiences or those moments, so for instance, a sauna box with no window, and maybe that would be something that the citizens might like.
Well, I think in science fiction, right, it's always shown as this pathetic attempt of the overlords to pretend you're not living in a hellscape, right? You're go to this room that has waterfalls playing on a screen and now you're feeling happy, but actually I have to say that having been in, living outside for 6 weeks is always hard, but living outside on ice is just ridiculously challenging. And one of the things that I realized, my tent mate, and by the way, we lived in an 8 foot by 8 foot tent, so we're very good friends now. she had brought with her, she had already been to Antarctica once, and she brought with her a set of essential oils. And she was just like, okay, you're having a bad day. So she's like, gave me your headphones. And it was like the sound of rain on leaves. And then she's like, smell eucalyptus. I'm like, and I just felt like it was a thing that I had been lacking, you know, the smell of something that wasn't our own armpits, right? Or food that we were cooking or nothing, you know, because Antarctica has no smells at all. It's just, it's the freshest, cleanest air and most delicious water, but it's no scent, nothing. And you know, to have that experience again of experiencing the smells of our beautiful planet and like the sounds, you know, there's no rain in Antarctica either. There's no precipitation like that. There's wind, but it's loud and it's really weird and creepy. It's very different than the wind gently through leaves or grass. And, you know, there's something incredibly nourishing about that experience that I don't think I fully appreciated until I lost it. And then just being there, like I went into my sleeping bag, put on a mask and was just like zoning out to like rain, like smelling different smells. But it felt so restorative. I actually really felt like, you know, even though it seems like that's not good enough, it actually really was. It got me to be like, okay, like we can do this, like it's okay. It just reminded me about a part of myself and memories that I had disconnected from. And so I actually think that's a really important idea, to not see the desolate beauty of the outside sometimes, and to remind yourself of this amazing, perfect planet that we currently live on. You know, I don't think that's bad, even as we become spacefaring. I think it's going to be important for us to remember where we came from.
It's very interesting because last time we were talking about this phrase book that we would have with all the jargon from born within the station as part of kind of like a cultural artifact. But then we could also have like a scented book with different kind of like pages, different scent from Earth or something like that. Would be quite an interesting artifact as well to build or to have to remind you of the different scent and places on Earth, which is also a funny thing to think about, that this would need to be, you know, thought about. Like there would be like, I don't know, people thinking and designing it and thinking what are the most important smells. So kind of like creating hierarchy on things that we didn't even think about would be needed in some ways. It's quite interesting in that way.
Yeah, I remember the like Moving to Mars show at the Design Museum. There was a piece of speculative design in there that, I mean, a lot of the design, I guess, was focusing on just like the voyage, because it's gonna be so long. And one person like proposed a kind of like a spacesuit that you could infuse like personal scents into your gloves. So like, I don't know, someone picked like the smell of like a freshly cut summer lawn. Someone else picked like the smell of their dog. And it made me think about, I guess, the relationships that we have to smell. And like is it like a necessarily personal sensation, or could it be something that was designed in a collective space instead of just like a kind of, you know, like you zone into the smell of eucalyptus or like the sound of rain in your headphones and like bundle up and kind of like delve back into that imaginary? Or could it actually be could it be part of the like shared space on the settlement? Yeah.
Well, wouldn't that be amazing if you could sort of, you know, come up with your sense, some curated sense before going, you know, everyone had their own set, and then you'd have like a space in which you could share, you know, you could do that by yourself, right? You could go into the space that is windowless, right? It's, you know, you can make it about yourself, or it could be big enough to share with others, right? You're like, hey, do you want to like come to my rainforest? Like, let's like, you know, or I don't know. I feel like that could actually be a way of connecting with people individually in a not work setting, where you could actually understand each other better outside of the context of trying to survive, you know, in the day-to-day work that you're doing.
That's quite. Oh, sorry, go for it.
No, I was just going to make a comment that, of course, like smell and these type of things like kind of remind you of different places. I was thinking that the visual aesthetics of kind of Apollo and everything is very like industrial, and it's very kind of industrial, but also like just a lot of metal or kind of the white suits, or it's a particular aesthetic. And when I was looking at news recently, they sent Emoko Bofo, who is a Ghanaian artist, they sent his artwork into space. And I'm not too sure why. I think he painted like these panels onto a craft, and it went into space. And there's a lot of kind of conversation of how important it is for art to be in space. And I think is that to like kind of break up the visual aesthetics as well, of how important moments of just, the most exciting painter at the moment as well, or are these just as important as I think my internet's gone again. Are these just as important as essential oils to kind of like calm us down to see kind of fantastic art too? Did anyone else see that report? I don't know if it actually is still in space, or if it comes back, or if it's just like art waste and it's just the action of Emoko's art going there.
I think that's a really important point, how we actually build on the different senses and what we do to kind of familiarize or customize our experience in space. And I think that putting art out into space, or having art in the space here, is kind of something that we want to really discuss with everybody. I think personally it's a kind of really important part of making our space kind of less sterile and more human. And that also, some of these things tie into, we've been speaking a lot about the individual kind of relationship with the situation and the artifacts, the things we can do as individuals to kind of mediate against our isolation, or being stuck in this awesome landscape or environment, place, or kind of contained within it. The point, Alice, that you made about being kind of sick, wanting to shut the window or turning your back on this, but I had enough of it. That was really interesting, but it also made me think, well, what if you've had enough of the other people around you? And like, I want to shut myself out of the space here, but also I don't want to see you anymore, or I've had enough of up to here with somebody. How do we start to kind of think that these interpersonal kind of relationships play out in these environments, and what kind of things maybe can we design, or can we take from existing kind of situations in Earth, perhaps, like thinking about cultural artifacts, cultural things maybe, and we think they would be necessary up in space on the moon to kind of mitigate against these situations and these instances. Like, Nina, when you were saying that your colleague gave you these things to kind of help you out, it's all very kind of positive. What about maybe we start to give people things because we want to cut them out, or we want the kind of opposite of all of that kind of side of things, maybe?
I have a good story about that. So again, my tent mate and I are very good friends, but we had this moment. So remember, we're living in an 8-foot by 8-foot tent. It's very close. We had not met before we went to Antarctica. So we were getting to know each other. And I'll just preface this by saying we are actually still friends now. But she told me, I was so excited to be there. And I tend to be pretty cheerful. And like, I would be like, top of the morning to you, tent mate, and like really excited to start the day and be chatty. And she's like, you know what? I hate you in the morning so much. I really want to stab you, but I don't want to stab you. So if you could go ahead and not speak to me before we start work at 9 a.m., that'd be great. And, people laugh about that because they're like, that's terrible. But no, actually, I think that was really important. She's like, I need to maintain a slow transition from sleeping to waking, and I cannot handle interacting with you. And so, please do not impose on my space, and I was really glad that she had said that. And so the way that we managed it was that we would just literally pretend the other one was not there. And I had an earlier schedule, so I would just get up earlier and I would leave the tent and do stuff. And then she could have some space there. And that was perfect. And when we all got together to start the day, I mean, it was perfect. She's like, hello, like, it's great to see you too, but she could not handle and I get it, because, if you're in that kind of space with somebody and you can't escape, that's very much like a spaceship, right? I can see, again, why people get stabbed, because they don't have those conversations, and they might not even know that that's what they need. They're just like, it could really build up. So I think that, having space that that is separate and yours is actually going to be incredibly critical, even if it's tiny, even if it's really, really small. And also just maybe that can be part of the training to be there. I think a lot of people aren't used to asking for that kind of thing, right? We don't need to ask for space because we can always just go into the bathroom and and just have or whatever, to go for a walk outside. We can't do that on the moon. That's going to be a small area, and we all have to work together. We can't just ignore each other. And so being able to discuss these things, I think, should be part of sort of the training and maybe the selection process for people there. And also, while at the same time building in literal spaces for people to just take a moment and be alone, whatever, just for however long they need.
So no space for being passive aggressive. Sorry, go for it.
No, I mean, I was just thinking, like, it's kind of a question of time and scale, like the conflict element, or like, having to kind of do a bit of damage control there, I guess. But I remember reading a social psychologist's take on like interpersonal relationships in space, like space colonization. And they were basically saying when the group is small, like around 15 people, there's probably not going to be much conflict just because there's no capacity for arguing. Like the stakes are too high, there's too few people, everyone depends too much on each other. But say you scale it up to 100 people, then there's much more of a capacity for people to kind of group off and form alliances and form grudges and preferences and kind of be picky with who they hang out with, who they get together with, where they spend their time. So, I mean, I think that's something that I was thinking about just now. And then also the question of scale, like, say you have like a pretty massive architecture, you're maybe you send like 20 people out there, but you're expecting it to grow to like 100 or 200 people in whatever, like a few generations. Are you going to send people, like 4 people or 12 people into this like massive like environment that feels really like agoraphobic and weird, and like maybe they'll have more space to themselves, but then also, I mean, it's super easy to become isolated maybe in that sort of environment? Or like, how do you scale up the architecture at an appropriate pace to like the development of a lunar society? I'm just thinking about.
On your first point, this is something eventually we very briefly discussed yesterday, but I think could be an interesting thing to relate to here now, which is this idea, obviously, and also related to the scale and the amount of inhabitants and stuff, but thinking that would this kind of like harsh lunar environment would lead to, or would force kind of like mutuality and the fact that kind of cooperation and work together, or if the numbers are too high, would that lead to this kind of competition, groups being in competition, putting competition and competition for resources and competition for things like that, knowing that everything needs to be manufactured and everything has a cost in some ways, not necessarily cost in terms of money, but has a cost in terms of resources in general. Maybe anyone's got a comment on that, perhaps. Or no comment at all whatsoever.
I think it would be hard for there to be factions that would ultimately be successful, because I think it would lead to the demise, depending on the scale, right? Because if we're talking about this single settlement, and we previously talked about maybe 150 people, even though anybody who is going to try to cut off resources to someone else, I mean, that is actually killing people, right? And so the stakes could not be any higher. And I think once you start to go there, right, the whole community fails. It's not something that anyone can win. Maybe you can win if you're the last person with all the air and water and food or something, but the cost is so high. And I think that you can see that certainly, again, in the Antarctic, where I think people are incredibly generous because, again, stakes are higher. If you don't have the right gloves, you could lose your fingers, right? You could freeze those, so people will be like, take these, take mine. People will give you things in a way that doesn't happen. And I think too, nations collaborate in Antarctica in ways that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, because it's literally people, life or death. So, and that could be any of us, right? Maybe it's this person today, but it's somebody else tomorrow. So actually, I would think that that some of the social tensions from these larger groups, which Alice pointed out, that actually might be mitigated somewhat by the shared reality of death that is just outside of the community. I mean, I guess I would hope so. We'll have to do the experiment to find out, but I feel pretty hopeful about that.
I mean, the classic case of a bunch of people who are thrown together and have to live with each other without danger is an academic department. and there's obviously without speaking in specifics, there's all kinds of politics. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower notoriously, when he was left the presidency of Columbia University to run for president, said, "Oh, I'm so delighted to get out of politics." But conversely, I have to say very much in support of my colleagues here at MIT and what I've seen in other departments in the last year and a half, when we faced deep and existential threats to models of teaching and learning and student support and all the rest, everyone does pull together. So I really, everything I've seen is that real danger and real issues bring out the best in human behavior. There is, though, this one, probably, at least Nina and probably many more of us here have read Aspley Cherry-Garrard's The Worst Journey in the World about the Scott expedition. And there are people who do more. And this is one of the points he makes about why is that there were people who are like, oh no, I'll do that. I'll go, I'll go get the, go out for the extra, errand, etc. And so I think having clear roles is also very helpful. Otherwise you do get, if it's purely volunteers, then some people volunteer more.
I was wondering, Nicholas, about the strike that you mentioned.
Yeah.
At the beginning, like how, what was the results after the strike?
NASA hired psychologists for the first time. That was really I mean, it was very interesting because it was this very macho, mission-oriented culture, and I kid you not, this idea of mental health. Sands talked about sex in space, and this idea of the whole person in space was really not part of the culture of NASA, particularly since NASA focused on these short, high danger, high goal missions where the whole thing really was treated like a military expedition. And then there was a huge shift between that and this idea of actually living in space. And when we're living, the whole person is involved. And I think that it's a very, this is very important at the scale of time and distance that we're thinking about it in space. And then, of course, always trying to bring things back to Earth. I don't know that we'll ever build a city on the moon. I do know that we're building our cities with technology now here on Earth. And technology doesn't tend on its own to include the whole person. Or when it does, it tends to optimize for a specific outcome like social media profit or another kind of or infrastructural surveillance, etc., not necessarily for our whole selves.
It's super interesting that it was like the solution was kind of psychiatrists and everything. And I was just wondering as well, like what we was discussing about, there's always someone working more. So yeah. Obviously with the strike, okay, it was idea was to make it more humane, the space kind of the project and everything, but there must have been someone that had to work even harder if they were striking, possibly in that case.
I mean, I think the people were tearing their hair out on Earth trying to figure out what was going on. The astronauts did take care of all the systems of the station, but they just didn't do all the experiments or other activities that they were supposed to do. And they all just actually, this is the huge difference between a lunar base and a space station. What they wanted to do but hadn't been given any time to do was just look out the window at the Earth. And eventually this led to the design of the cupola in the current International Space Station and the recognition that yeah, the greatest movie ever made is playing outside the windows. The Earth, you know, rotates underneath you at 28,000 miles an hour, and to not being able to not have a second of to be able to look at it was literally driving them nuts. So.
That's a really nice point to kind of bring us round with the kind of views of Earth, views out, ways of designing kind of elements of this architecture to manage and kind of mediate the people and population on board there. So yeah, that kind of ties it around quite nicely, I think, the cupola example. Just checking. I think maybe we're kind of coming towards the end of our session. Maybe we could just kind of start to think a little bit now in the time we have a bit more about some of these artifact structures, devices, mechanisms that we can use in these situations. So we're talking about the cupola, the way we look out, and we're talking about the kind of implementation of psychiatry or kind of mental health provision. In the chat, there's quite a lot of kind of stuff going on as well about these kind of how this therapy might actually play out, how this kind of interaction would take place. If we could just kind of think a little bit about the actual artifacts and elements that, how these are embodied, basically, these ideas, how they might become things or kind of be given some tangibility a little bit. Even if it's just thinking about kind of, one of the things we've been trying to do in these sessions is coming up with kind of archive of artifacts, of objects, of things. So we could think about the kind of smell headphones as a thing which kind of could be issued to people that helps them in their environment. Here is a really kind of dumb kind of example of that. But yeah.
Like Moon ASMR type of the album.
Exactly.
I wonder if.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No, go for it if you, please.
I was just thinking, one of the things that might actually be pretty important, and maybe this isn't as important as other things like, the sense, but, given how dry the moon is, water is going to be incredibly important, and being able to manage your water, both your intake and your supply. And I kind of feel like, so I know I have a lot of European colleagues who like to make fun of people in the US for bringing water bottles everywhere. You guys are so thirsty. Why are you drinking so much water? But actually I think maybe in a place like, this lunar base, it may be having, a water intake strategy where you have like different containers that you're taking with you. It's going to be a lot less heavy to carry around than your liter Nalgene that maybe you're carrying around now. But maybe there can be, different kinds of pouches that can fit into different clothing. And so then you can keep track. It will be a way for you to, you've seen these before. How much water have you had? I assume that the air is going to be also incredibly dry in the base, just because it's going to be hard to humidify it. So maybe, like water carrying strategies and ways to figure out how much you've taken in, it will be an important thing. So that could be an artifact that you would carry.
Excellent. The actual monitoring of how much you take, or how much other people take as well, and whether that's clear, like, oh my gosh, you've had that much, I've not had, hang on a second. Again, disparities and problems maybe come up with that. But
I can't help but notice the AI discussion in the chat. I feel like that's something we should probably talk about. I mean, yeah, I guess would there be like a human HR department on Mars? Or, because I feel like the kind of probability of offloading some of that psychological labor would be placed on a machine. Like, it does make sense to me that an AI would be used to fulfill a certain level of individual psychological mental well-being. But then I'm also wondering about the kind of stakes of that as well. I mean, previous efforts to develop AI psych chatbots like never seem to go very well. And it would also potentially enable an element of people not feeling the need to confide in each other if there's like a smarter child just on the other side of the door, you know? So I don't know. I mean, sorry, this kind of deviates from our plan to get uber technical and devise some hardcore design proposals, but I do think it's something that we should talk about because yeah, I don't know. I mean, generally speaking, yeah, no, go for it.
No, sorry, carry on with your point. No, I was just going to say that there is like maybe an entry point into the AI where the AI could maybe just like check in with you. And I think there's already some sort of NHS app where you can like rank how you feel. And if, say, you're on the very like kind of extreme end, like, you know, you're feeling kind of like, you know, 2 out of 10 or something, or it will then kind of take you to like a human, and then the human will then kind of take on the job of making you feel better or diagnosing or sorting out some like how you're feeling. So I think there's definitely a space for the AI to maybe check in with you every day, maybe even in the morning, like Nina, what you were saying about how your partner didn't have space to talk to you in the morning, but maybe the AI would have space to just check in. You know, just be like, did you sleep well? And then like out of 10, like how good was your sleep or something? And then if it's kind of the fact that you actually need to be redirected to speak to a person or speak to your assigned partner from there. So in a way, there could be an artifact in a way that is just the entry point, but it's not going to be the solution. It's not going to kind of be your sounding board, but it could kind of help to navigate where you go to like feel better. I don't know if that would be like an app, or the artifact is a personal little app that you would have to check in with you throughout the day or in the morning.
Well, it's funny you're saying that, because actually, so one of the things that we do in Antarctica as part of the Antarctic Meteorite Search Project is to do a human factor study for NASA, which is analog, but we all volunteered to do it, and we filled out 3 pages of the same questions every day, right? How are you feeling? How do you like your teammates today? You know, it actually was that. And so there was no opportunity there. Ooh, did I freeze? Oh no, okay, here we go. So there was no opportunity for real-time feedback, which I think that's what maybe that system was lacking. But there are studies that have been done showing how group dynamics wax and wanes, because you can actually track everybody's feelings over that same 40-day period, which is actually pretty amazing. But so I think like it would actually be pretty easy to incorporate that, as long as it wasn't, you know, I actually found the hardest part about it was like writing by hand, because my hand would be cold. And like, I'm just like, ugh, I don't know if anyone can even read this, like, you know. So I think making it something like if you had some kind of a handheld device and having it be a little more interactive. The only thing that I would worry about is that people would not be honest, right? They would have to, somebody would know how to game that system, right? They're like, I feel amazing. I'm going to kill everyone today. Like, you know, don't come looking for me. I'm fine. Just like, you know, so I don't know, like I think there has to be like, you know, that could be the sort of the baseline, but I feel like maybe once a month, maybe like there could be like a thing where you're like, your check-in where somebody sees if you have crazy eye or something, that you're, you know, if you've been deteriorating, there would be an official way to have a human, you know, at least just to sign off on that and not just rely on self-reporting.
Okay, thank you very much I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much for participating. I'm just, conscious of the time, and I don't want to keep people longer than this particular event, but I just want to quickly, thank all our participants, and also for all these kind of conversation, for these ideas and sharing things. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things that we haven't been able to cover, and there's a lot of ideas and comments as well within the chat. So thank you very much as well for everyone who participated into the chat as well. This would be as Nick eventually said at the very beginning, this would be archived as well as a Google public document. So because there's like so many interesting links, so many kind of thoughts as well that I think are very relevant to this conversation. But yeah, thank you very much for being with us and joining us in this particular event. I just want to add one thing regarding our next and final event of the Lunar Denizens, which will be, the name will be Down to Earth, and which will happen on the 4th of November. And we'll have Charmian Griffin with us, who's the head of Digital Art Angel, kind of like helping producing visual art. It's a kind of visual arts organization that help produce visual arts. We have also with us actually Caitlin McShear, who's the director of the Santa Fe Institute InterPlanetary project. So that's pretty great. She's also been a major kind of organizer of these events. So that's going to be quite nice. We'll have as well julijonas urbonas, potentially, who couldn't actually, for personal reason, couldn't actually attend today. And we also have Joseph Popper with us, who's an artist who's based in Switzerland. Here we go. So that was all the things. Like, thank you so much. These events always feel so short because the conversation is always so good. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everybody. And see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.